Hey, hi, full crazy town number four. And here we are, Eugene, Oregon, last sunny, warm day of the year. Glad to be advertising on Due Dissidence. It really helps. I'm about to get shadow banned off of other sites, but I do want to try to get through this. I'm about a third or a quarter of the way through with four, I don't know, maybe 10 podcasts will cover it. I would like to get through and maybe try to get on other sites. But where I left off talking about Robert Maxwell and Ghislaine Maxwell, she was the one who partnered with Epstein, and the rest is history. But when I start off here, he encouraged Ghislaine to hang out with Jeffrey Epstein. He is Ghislaine's dad, Robert Maxwell. He encouraged Ghislaine to hang out with Jeffrey Epstein, who was involved with arms trafficking along with Adnan Khashoggi, later dismembered by the Saudis, and known as a major player in the Iran-Contra scandal. In the Adnan Khashoggi and Jeff partnered in the UK, and Adnan was known for laundering his criminal gains through the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. Epstein also laundered money through various foundations, including the Bills, Clintons, and Gates, gaining considerable influence in politics and big tech. The book Surveillance Valley by Yasha Levine details how the biggest shopping, information, and social media companies rule Washington, D.C. through what Whitney Webb calls the national security state. They control D.C. by controlling the narratives, that is, the imperialist propaganda, by threats, demonetization, censorship, shadow banning. They use their tech advantage to track dissidents the way they've been doing since the civil rights and anti war movements. There is a main core database of dissidents to be rounded up when the national security state takes absolute control. This database is controlled by Palantir, founded by Peter Thiel, a billionaire co-founder of PayPal. Palantir replaced DARPA, which was the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, replaced a DARPA database run by John Poindexter, Reagan's national security advisor, convicted of multiple felonies stemming from the Iran-Contra affair. Poindexter was connected to Thiel by Richard Perle, Bush Jr.'s architect of the Iraq War. Thiel rescued a social media site from being discontinued, and then it went out of business and a new company, Facebook, began. Incidentally, they're the ones threatening to close my account for unspecified reasons. Instagram, too. Anyway, starting in 1980 and lasting until 2007, Epstein's biggest benefactor was Les Wexner, billionaire owner of Victoria's Secret, Abercrombie and Fitch, and Bath and Body Works. He was Epstein's main client in Jeff's money management firm, and he was the previous owner of Epstein's $56 million Manhattan townhouse, which Wexner transferred to an Epstein owned entity. Epstein's ownership, the townhouse to electronically snoop guests. In 1985, Columbus lawyer Arthur Shapiro was found murdered, and the police chief accidentally released information that linked Wexner to organized crime. Shapiro had managed Wexner's account for his law firm, and Wexner was involved with Francis Walsh, whose trucking firm did 90% of Wexner's shipping. Walsh was a co-conspirator of the Genovese crime family boss Fat Tony Salerno, whose lawyer was Roy Cohn, and Roy was co-founder of the Mega Group, which united several well-known pro-Israel businessmen plus organized crime, Modalitz, and Israel's Mossad. Robert Maxwell was a business partner of the other Mega Group co-founder Charles Bronfman, who, after Israel was founded, worked with future Prime Minister Shimon Peres to provide Canadian armaments to Israel. Peres would go on to introduce another future Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, to Jeffrey Epstein. Before Israel was founded, Robert Maxwell greatly influenced the Czech government's decision to arm Zionist paramilitaries, and he smuggled aircraft parts to Israel. British intelligence offered him a job, but Israel did not want him to take it. There's evidence that Mossad had provided him with prostitutes and filmed his encounters, matching the blackmailing practice being used by the CIA and the mafia. In 1991, Epstein got power of attorney over Wexner's affairs. In 1995, he became director of the Wexner Foundation, often attending fashion shows and hosting the models at his New York City home. He also helped aspiring models get work at Victoria's Secret. In 1996, his firm's name was changed for tax reasons to Financial Trust Company and was based in St. Thomas, Virgin Island, where he conducted his business through J.P. Morgan. In 2000, he was president of Liquid Funding Limited, selling complex unsecured securities. In 2007, after a major investor asked about his investment, the fund collapsed. 3 months later, before Bear Stearns' failure touched off a worldwide recession. In May of 2008, he began a plea deal in Miami with U.S. Attorney Rene Acosta over sex with minors, and Acosta was told to go easy on him because he was involved with U.S. intelligence and above his pay grade, in quotes. 2015, he was heavily invested in a startup that later became Carbine, connected with Israel's defense industry. He considered moving to Israel to escape sex charges. Another bank tied to Epstein, Deutsche Bank, was fined $150 million for ignoring Epstein's red flag warnings, then another $75 million a few months later. A lawsuit was brought by investors against Deutsche Bank over its handling of Epstein's financial matters. The bank was accused of paying restitution, hush money, to 40 different families in connection with Epstein's sex trafficking. The judge assigned to the case was Esther Salas. Her son was shot and killed on 7/20/2020 by someone posing as a FedEx driver, and her husband was critically wounded. Spring 23 saw Deutsche on shaky financial ground as headlines warned bank collapse risk grows as experts wait for the next domino to fall. The next one turned out to be First Republic Bank, the second largest bank failure ever. JP Morgan Chase agreed to take over and profited by $2.6 billion, while the FDIC, that is taxpayers, paid $13 billion. However, all is not swell in Jamie Dimon land. JPM Chase was sued by the U.S. Virgin Islands for $290 million for doing business with Epstein. JP Morgan, in turn, is suing Jes Staley over ties to Epstein, possibly to deflect scrutiny. Staley was the CEO of Barclays Bank from 2015 until he was forced to resign due to his ties to Epstein. JP Morgan Chase paid millions in fines for illegally making billions in profits. Effective altruism. In the 2000s, William McCaskill and two other philosophers started this movement designed to use evidence and reasoning to benefit people. Sam Bankman-Fried of FTX infamy was backed by Peter Thiel, who founded PayPal and Palantir. Sam practiced effective altruism, and all three, Pete, Will, Sam, participated in Event 201, held on October 18th, 2019, in conjunction with Klaus Schwab's World Economic Forum and the Bill Gates Foundation. This was a high-level pandemic exercise designed to illustrate the areas where public-private partnerships will be necessary during the response to severe pandemic to diminish large-scale economic and societal consequences. One of McCaskill's organizations was tied to the anthrax attacks on senators who were against the Bush-Cheney Patriot Act. Another is Open Philanthropy, like Effective Altruism, run by Facebook co-founder Dustin Moskovitz. These organizations and people are preparing the Everything app, which will introduce a digital dollar, bank, and ID system, CBDC, like the WeChat in China. China is considered the model by our government because US envies the total control they have over their citizens. Big banks are scamming Americans via financial crises again and again. High interest rates and inflation are meant to crush workers and cause high unemployment. The dot-com crash was preceded by Michael Milken's, Drexel, Burnham, and Lambert's bankruptcy in 1990, part of the savings and loan crash of the 80s. Every crash brings financial ruin for millions of citizens, workers, and small businesses, while some banks remain too big to fail and then just get bigger and bigger with each bailout and then with each merger and acquisition. In short, these people are criminal psychopaths. They represent pure evil, the same label they apply to their opponents. They cast all complaints and accusations into the conspiracy theory bin, a common deflection for many decades. It was Allen Dulles, head of the CIA in the 50s, who coined the phrase conspiracy theory, as he dismissed alternative explanations to the lone gunman theory in Dallas. Interestingly enough, after John Barnett, Boeing quality control worker for many decades, was suicided, it came to light that one of Boeing's main contractors is named Grassy Knoll Boeing. 3 months later, another Boeing whistleblower was found dead. A conspiracy just means people got together and talked or conspired about something. Whether they're conspiring about something good or evil is determined by those judging the talks and the texts. We're being herded by a techno-feudalistic slavery system where our rights are stripped and the looting and pillaging continues with trillions up for grabs. The Everything app, also known as the central bank digital currency, incorporates transhumanism, modern day eugenics, into the merger of Silicon Valley, the healthcare industry, and big pharma. COVID set the standard for mandates, including restricted travel, conditional employment, and house arrests. Lockdowns did immeasurable harm to our economy and society at large. The World Economic Forum's public private partnership seized upon this turmoil to plan for a better future, save the climate by reducing carbon based fertilizers, which would reduce crop yields and subsequently reduce populations. Huge protests in India, Netherlands, France, and Brussels resulted in general strikes, violence, and the spreading unrest. The Dutch began seizing farmland in May of 2023. India began calling in its loans to farmers, resulting in thousands of bankruptcies. Pushback against the lockdowns and mandates came when Canadian truckers convoyed from west to east, and Trudeau responded by declaring a state of emergency and shutting down the protesters' bank accounts. The central bank digital currency is coming. Our government wants everyone to use it, and then our bank accounts can be frozen and our money taken in an instant should we dare to support groups or ideas that the authorities don't like. DARPA was created by Ike in response to Sputnik in '57. Part of the Department of Defense, it focused on the emerging technologies for use by the military and has been responsible for all or part of weather satellites, personal computer, the Internet of Things, GPS, drones, stealth technology, voice interfaces, and Moderna's C-19 vaccine. Digital currency will be used to control populations the way WeChat is being used in China. A branch of the global powerhouse Tencent, WeChat is at the heart of smart cities, a plan for global dominance through technology, restricted travel, manufactured crises, censorship, cracking down on dissent, and malinformation. There will be virtual reality goggles for those who can't afford vacations. Rumor has it that the Maui fire was allowed to burn so that a town could be wiped out just a fortnight before the WEF arrived with their smart city plan. Chapter 4, Russiagate, Trauma, and More Quotes. Investigative reporter Matt Taibbi described Russiagate as a hand grenade blowing apart his relationship with family and friends. Same with me. My doubts about the Democratic Party increased and peaked when the proxy war began. I felt abandoned when my family and friends dismissed me and my concerns as just being Russia propaganda. My PTSD only increased as the war dragged on, boosted daily by our corporate media and the BBC. It's only by consuming independent media that I've been able to find a community that I can relate to. Here's how the Russiagate trick was performed. BuzzFeed News prodded FBI Chief Comey to debrief Trump about the collusion investigations. Then the FBI gives this information to John McCain, who forwards it to other members of Congress and officials, then back to Trump, and then reporters, including James Corn of Mother Jones, they start the perpetual motion machine. Trump was debriefed. The Clinton campaign and the DNC, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, directly funded the infamous Steele dossier by funneling more than $1 million through their law firm, Perkins Coie, which in turn hired Steele's client, Fusion GPS. The FBI relied on the Steele dossier to spy on Carter Page, Trump's campaign aide, while concealing from the FISA court that approved the warrant that the Clinton campaign paid for it. The FBI offered Steele $1 million if he could prove the allegations, but he declined. The FBI still relied on it to file the first surveillance warrant on Page just 2 weeks later, and then 3 more renewals after that. Fusion GPS, the DC based opposition research firm that also employed Steele, actively coordinated with friendly journalists to disseminate articles about Alpha Bank. H.R. Clinton, Hillary Rodham, approved the infamous Alpha Bank hoax, and the disinformation industry was launched. A desktop site, Hamilton 68, began disseminating FBI Fed stories daily for years that had not a scintilla of truth. The damage continued. There was new language, new narratives, new ways of doing things. As Matt Taibbi digs through the Twitter files, he finds NGOs, groups that specialize in dispensing lies about all the news stories every day. They were funded by taxpayer money, always blaming Trump, his 75 million followers, Putin, China, domestic terrorists, fascists, dissenters, right-wing conservatives, and or others. Chris Hedges, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for the New York Times at one time, former Middle Eastern bureau chief at one time, Arabic speaker, war reporter there for 7 years, says there's no way to explode the myth that Russiagate was responsible for the election of Donald Trump. He says myths are impervious to the facts. Myths fulfill an emotional yearning. They're a short circuit from reality into a world of childish simplicity. Hard and painful questions are avoided. Thought terminating cliches are spat out to blissfully embrace a willed ignorance. The cynical con the Democratic Party and the FBI carried out to falsely portray Trump as a puppet of the Kremlin worked and continues to work because it is what those who detest Trump want to believe. If Russia is blamed for Trump's election, we avoid the unpleasant reality of our failed democratic institutions and decaying empire. We avoid facing the inevitable rise of a Christian fascism born out of widespread impoverishment, rage, despair, and abandonment. We avoid acknowledging the complicity of the Democratic Party in the orchestration of the largest social inequality in our nation's history, the evisceration of our basic liberties, endless wars, and an electoral system bankrolled by the billionaire class, which is nothing more than legalized bribery. The way AIPAC and lobbyists saturate members of Congress with money. The myth allows the American people to believe that the Democratic politicians, like the establishment Republicans who have joined them, are the guarantees of the democracy that they destroyed. Our reality is bleak and frightening, especially given the abject refusal by the ruling oligarchs like Gates, Zuck, Bezos, Warren Buffett, Larry Fink, and most of the other Fortune 500 CEOs to deal seriously with our crumbling infrastructure, shrinking middle class, increased poverty, climate emergency. Oligarchs twist solutions to these crises to favor their own interests. They pay lip service to NGOs, the #MeToo movement, BLM, LGBTQ movements. The media just parrot whatever the so called elites want them to say, which mostly consists of diatribes about pledging allegiance to subgroups to gain favor, publicity, and donations to these groups. The monumental task of restoring democracy outside the confines of a broken electoral system and corporate indentured institutions is daunting enough and not guaranteed. We stand on the cusp of tyranny as we blame Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping for their authoritarianism. The liberal class, CNN, MSNBC, and others, promoted the Trump Russia connections, including the New York Times and Washington Post, which shared a Pulitzer Prize in 2018 for their reporting on alleged Russian interference during the 2016 election. They made up thousands of stories and reports that falsely painted the Trump administration as a tool of Russia. Their readers and viewers were fed a comforting myth that America is a good and virtuous nation. Myths make us feel good. They demonize those blamed for our self created debacles. Myths create us as a people and nation, or excuse me, myths celebrate us as a people and nation, but it is like handing heroin to junkies. Shatter the myths, even if the facts are incontrovertible, and you become a pariah. Chris found this out when he and a handful of others, including Robert Scheer, Phil Donahue, and Michael Moore, denounced the calls to invade Iraq. It made no difference that Chris had spent 7 years reporting in the region, including Iraq. He was censored, driven from the New York Times, attacked by Bush Jr.'s useful idiots in the media and the Democratic Party as an apologist for Saddam Hussein. For Chris Hedges, these myths have a shattering effect. They set up a cult of the self, which feeds into the corporate coup and its ruthless exploitation of the natural resources and all forms of life. This corporate capitalism thrives on the fostering of chronic psychological and physical disorders, the pathologies of despair, alienation, high blood pressure, diabetes, anxiety, depression, morbid obesity, mass shootings, now almost 2 per day, domestic and sexual violence, drug overdoses, over 100,000 per year, suicides, 22, including 23 U.S. veterans per day. These are the consequences of a deeply traumatized society. The core traits of the psychopaths: superficial charm, grandiosity, and self importance, a need for constant stimulation, a penchant for lying, deception, manipulation, and the inability to feel remorse or guilt are celebrated. The virtues of empathy, compassion, and self sacrifice are belittled, neglected, and crushed. The professions that sustain community, such as teaching, manual labor, the arts, journalism, nursing, are underpaid and the workers are overworked. The professions that exploit such as those in high finance, big pharma, oil, insurance, real estate, munitions, agriculture, and information technology are lavished with prestige, money, and power. The fact that millions of people share the same vices does not make these vices virtues. The fact that they share so many errors does not make the errors to be truths. And the fact that millions of people share the same forms of mental pathology does not make these people sane. As Eric Fromm writes in The Sane Society. Russell Dobular has a funny take on those who have bought into the American exceptionalism model. He says that the Roman people probably cheered on Julius Caesar as he swept through Germania and Gaul. He posits that as long as they had their bread and circuses, they were happy to cheer on the Roman legions, much as modern day sports fans root for their favorite athletes and teams. Then, as non Romans populated the legions and the Praetorian Guard began selling their services to the highest bidder, the empire fell apart. Classic works on trauma by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk and Dr. Gabor Mate and Dr. Judith Herman state bluntly what is accepted as normal behavior in a corporate society is at war with basic human needs and our psychological and physical health. Huge segments of the American public, especially the tens of millions of people who've been discarded and marginalized, endure chronic trauma. Barbara Ehrenreich, in her book Nickel and Dimed on Not Getting By in America, described the life of the working poor as one long emergency. This trauma is as destructive to us as it is socially and politically. It leaves us in a state of dysphoria where confusion, agitation, emptiness, and loneliness define our lives. Whole segments of American society, especially the poor, have been rendered superfluous and invisible. As Dr. van der Kolk writes, trauma is when we are not seen and known. Our culture teaches us to focus on our personal uniqueness, but at a deeper level, we barely exist as individual organisms. Trauma numbs our capacity to feel, it fractures our self, it disconnects us from our bodies, it keeps us in a state of hyper arousal, it makes us confuse our desires, often artificially implanted by the consumer society, with our needs. Traumatized people view the world around them as hostile and dangerous. They lack a positive image of themselves and lose the capacity to trust. Many replace intimacy and love with sexual sadism or masochism, which is how we became a pornified culture. Trauma creates what the psychologist Robert J. Lifton calls counterfeit, a counterfeit world defined by phantom enemies, lies, and dark conspiracies, purpose, and a life of meaning. Trauma, Dr. Herman writes, impels people both to withdraw from close relationships and to seek them desperately. It induces feelings of shame, guilt, inferiority. She writes, as well as the need to avoid reminders of the trauma that occurs in daily life. Trauma severely compromises the capacity for intimacy. Trauma can dramatically reduce focus to extremely limited goals, often a matter of hours or days. If trauma entails a disconnection from the self, then it makes sense to say that we're being collectively flooded with influences that both exploit and reinforce trauma. Dr. Mate writes, work pressures, multitasking, social media, news updates, multiplicities of entertainment sources, these all induce us to become lost in thoughts, frantic activities, gadgets, meaningless conversations. We're caught up in pursuits of all kinds that draw us on, not because they're necessary or inspiring or uplifting, or because they enrich our lives, but simply because they obliterate the present. Trauma also drives many to flee into the arms of those who are orchestrating the abuse. Systematic and repetitive trauma, whether by a single abuser or a political system, destroys personal autonomy. The perpetrator becomes omnipotent. Resistance is accepted as futile. The goal of the perpetrator is to install in his victims not only fear, but also gratitude for being allowed to live. Dr. Herman writes, this trauma lays the foundation for the most insidious characteristic of all tyrannies, large and small, total control. Prolonged trauma reduces victims to a state of psychological infantilism. It conditions them to plead for their own enslavement. We're not content with negative obedience, not even with the most abject submission. George Orwell wrote of the ruling inner party in his novel 1984. Another quote, when you surrender to us, it must be of your own free will. We do not destroy the heretic because he resists us. So long as he resists us, we never destroy him. We convert him. We capture his inner mind. We reshape him. We burn all evil and all illusion out of him and bring him over to our side, not in appearance, but genuinely, heart and soul. Chris Hedges' book, American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War on America, says the fascists prey on this trauma. They replicate systems of control common to all tyrannies, including cults. Christian fascists skillfully break down adherents, severing them from their families and communities. They manipulate their shame, despair, feelings of worthlessness, and guilt, the byproducts of their trauma, to demand total obedience to the church leadership, who almost always are white and male. These leaders, supposedly spokesperson for God, cannot be questioned or criticized. The connecting tissue among the disparate militia groups, QAnon, conspiracy theorists, anti abortion activists, right wing patriot organizations, Second Amendment advocates, neo Confederates, and Trump supporters that stormed the Capitol on January 6th is not only this Christian fascism, but trauma. Totalitarian governments demand confession and political conversion of their victims, Dr. Herman writes. Slaveholders demand gratitude from their slaves. Religious cults demand ritualized sacrifices as a sign of submission to the divine will of the leader. Perpetrators of domestic battery demand that their victims prove complete obedience and loyalty by sacrificing all other relationships. Sex offenders demand that their victims find sexual fulfillment in submission. Total control over another person is the power dynamic at the heart of pornography. The erotic appeal of this fantasy to millions of terrifyingly normal men fosters an immense industry in which women and children are abused, not in fantasy, but realistically. Donald Trump is a perpetrator and a savior. He personifies the callous indifference of patriarchy, wealth, privilege, and power towards the vulnerable, as well as the promise that once his cultish followers surrender to him, they will be fires in equal measure, fear and solace. Joe Biden does the same. CNN and Fox issue the same dire warnings and make the same shallow promises. People who embrace the small tyrannies are much more susceptible to embracing the large ones. Republicans embrace the subordination of women, the subordination of people of color, conforming people, and the subordination of non Christians. So it's not a party that embraces democracy. Democrats pretend to care about race and gender issues, while carrying on their hegemonic goals. Polls show that a vast majority of Americans favor a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, but Biden refuses to listen to them. Trump is a rock solid supporter of everything Israel wants to do. Both parties put tyrannical leaders on the ballot and say that their candidate is the lesser of two evils. In Dr. Vander Kolk's The Body Keeps Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma, he opens with stark statistics compiled by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, showing that not 1 in 5 Americans was sexually molested. Excuse me, showing that 1 in 5 Americans was sexually molested as a child. 1 in 4 was beaten by a parent to the point of leaving a mark being left on their body. And 1 in 3 couples engage in physical violence. A quarter of us grew up with alcoholic relatives, and 1 out of 8 witnessed their mother being hit or beaten. These adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, set up a lifetime of frustration, anger, pain, and trauma. The endemic trauma in American society, which is getting worse under the onslaught of the gig economy, pronounced social inequality, indiscriminate police violence, the climate crisis, and the seizure of the political process and most institutions by corporations and the ruling oligarchs as our most serious public health crisis. It has grave individual, social, and political consequences. If trauma is truly a social problem, Dr. Herman in Truth and Repair, How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice, writes, recovery cannot simply be a private individual matter. The wounds of trauma are not merely those caused by the perception of violence and exploitation. The actions or inactions of bystanders, all those who are complicit in or who blame the victims, often cause deeper wounds. Full healing, she adds, because it originates in a fundamental injustice, requires a full hearing within the community to repair through some measure of justice the trauma survivors have endured. Recovery has to take place in relationships, she goes on, when people feel connected to their communities and re-accepted in their communities, then the shame is relieved and the isolation is relieved. And that really creates the platform for healing. The key is community, not virtual communities, but communities where we connect, reconnect, and see in our wounds the wounds of others. It requires access without onerous medical bills to mental health professionals. It requires the dismantling of the corporate structures of suppression. It demands a new ethic, one that values empathy and self sacrifice. We must reject the cynicism, indifference, and cult of the self that all tyrannies inculcate those they dominate and those who are demonized. We must uncouple ourselves from cynicism. The moral philosopher Bernard Williams argues that resentment and indignation are as important as empathy and connection to solidify social bonds. It's not only that it's not only our own dignity we must protect, but the dignity of others. Those shared sentiments, he writes, bind people together in a community of feeling. Acts of resistance around these shared sentiments, this community of feeling, establish us as distinct autonomous beings. We may not defeat these tyrannies, but by battling against them, we free ourselves from the grip of small and large tyrannies that deform American society. That's the point. Fight the power, not because you must win, because you must fight the power. James Madison wrote in the 10th article of Confederation from the Federalist Papers about John Jay, who didn't want the poor to rise up and demand equality. So Madison told him not to worry. He said to lean into the problem, pretend to care about the masses, while pointing out the reasons they should fear and hate those who are different from them. He said to encourage rugged individualism and going it alone, your own merits. Dominant narratives, talking points, and propaganda provide plenty of distractions for the factions, including abortion rights, race relations, immigrants, regional differences, political leaders, religion, and special interests. Madison wrote about the framers' interests being contrary to the interests of the communities. He saw factions as inevitable due to human nature. He saw our preferences as something that could be taken advantage of. He said that as long as people having different opinions, amounts of wealth, and property, that is, slaves, they will continue to form alliances with people who are most similar to themselves. The mistake the American left makes includes thinking that all these diverse demands will somehow add up to a bigger and better class struggle. They won't. This is a huge group of oppressed minorities, all demanding that their wants and needs be immediately met. We should we all should reassess our needs. What is your goal? More recognition as the most oppressed minority or better economic conditions? Do you want a hateful, fearful, dystopian future or one that more resembles your ethics, principles, and morals? Full crazy town is nothing new. Ever since the first big lie of the 21st century, weapons of mass destruction, our government has been lying and trying to divide the world into absolutes, good and evil, right and wrong, best and worst. It's a zero sum game, all or nothing, winners or losers, no middle ground, no compromise. The lies came faster and faster as they were required. We need to stay in Iraq and Afghanistan indefinitely because freedom and democracy. We need to team up with Al Qaeda in Syria because, as Jake Sullivan said to Hillary, Al Qaeda is on our side. Other twisted narratives, the Hunter Biden laptop story, Russian disinformation. Russia is putting bounties on American soldiers. Russia was not provoked in defending its border region against neo Nazis in Ukraine. We must support Biden's commitment to Israel, no matter what. However, anyone interested in such concepts as context, nuanced details, and or backstories quickly sees through this facade. Our government has been lying to us for decades to serve their own interests, especially when it comes to military matters. Approximately one-third of all countries in the world have been threatened by US backed coups or sanctions since World War II. All they need to do is ramp up fear, start and maintain military operations around the world, add to the $1 trillion annual military budget, get new contracts for Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, and Northrop Grumman, and then present themselves as the only ones who can keep us safe. The economist Adam Smith warned about people who see wars from a distance, the ones who talk and write about it with a sense of bravado, a pulsing sense of excitement. He said that people get addicted to the excitement, particularly to the imperial capitals. As money and lies take over, democracy takes a back seat. The news becomes a reality show bent on fear mongering and chaos to get people to beg for protection and entertainment to help them forget that they asked for it. Smith also wrote in his Wealth of Nations about the satisfaction that comes from knowing you're superior, like the liberal support for the war and domination, discrediting all peaceniks. He suggests that this superiority goal is more important than monetary gains. In 2003, Thomas Friedman, New York Times star, wrote as he thumped the war drum with both hands and both feet, he said that Americans have a need to see their country at war. He said we, quotation marks, had to burst the Taliban's bubble. He said we need to talk and go in with a big stick to show that we're strong. He was okay with seeing soldiers deploy and die. About his big stick, he said to the Taliban, "Suck on this." Rachel Maddow has recently said it's important that Russia lose. After Russia's invasion, reporters at the White House briefing were asking for specific weapons to be sent to Ukraine, like Puma drones and Vampire anti drone rockets. The corporate media awards the biggest liars with the fattest contracts. Maddow was the biggest pusher of Russiagate lies, so she was given a $35 million contract or $100,000 a day. The pandemic was treated like an existential threat, and government reactions were militaristic and tyrannical. The billionaire class had and still has a lot to gain by hyping up the emergency, fear, panic, hatred index. Problem is, they must keep amping up the tone, intensity, frequency, duration, volume, and immediacy of the crisis every day. This involves a surveillance state bent on totalitarian rule, as Matt Taibbi has been describing in his reports on Hamilton 68 and the Twitter files. Maintaining the US Israel alliance is an existential issue for the Democrats. Another way to lie, cheat, and steal? Just float out some crazy wacko theory and see how it's received. Trump used to do this all the time. His nutty proposal would get discussed, debated, criticized, and or supported, so the next time it came up, it wouldn't seem quite as insane. Or, like Anne Applebaum, Polish ambassador, journalist, historian, said about her husband, Polish politician, journalist Radoslaw Sikorski, when he said in response to the Nord Stream pipeline bombing, "Thank you, USA," his wife Anne said it was just a joke. Members of the LGBTQ factions take turns demanding more and more attention as they vie to be the most oppressed victims. The trans rights activists trot out more ways to protest the Christian conservatives and their "stop sexualizing our children" agendas. Matt Taibbi says the Trump Russia story was more than just a hoax. It was a system wide effort to reframe reality, which was both too intellectually ambitious to fit in a word like hoax, but also probably not against any one law either. This is counterterrorism strategy, focusing on domestic terrorism and political dissents, a new public-private disinformation complex focusing on Trump and other radicals. More unnerving is how seemingly smart people quickly constructed an ideology of mass surrender. They've been spun around, they're dizzy and therefore more susceptible because they're desperate for something to orient them to decrease the severity of the chaos. Once people have been convinced to go along with conspiracies, they'll keep going along, not because they want to be conspirators, but because they are convinced that they're on the side of good. Once they're convinced Trump or anyone else is a Russian agent, they attack him and his minions. They made the mistake of believing everything that Rachel Maddow and Keith Olbermann said and listened to what Adam Schiff said and believed him too about seeing evidence of Trump's collusion. Now, trying to get them to abandon their convictions is very difficult. They would have to admit they've been fooled by the avatar of the government, the FBI. In July 2023, federal judge Terry Doughty issued an order barring a long list of federal agencies, including the FBI, CDC, Homeland Security, Global Engagement Center, and the State Department, from meeting with social media companies to suppress protected free speech. This ruling was challenged and overturned, but has been appealed, repackaged as Murphy versus Missouri. Next is chapter 5. I'm at the end of my hour. Chapter 5 will be Hamilton 68 and some remedies. That's the point of my book, are remedies. I really kind of regret going on and on about the deep state and all that it entails, because all I'm going to do is get myself completely banned. But I will work on other sites if that happens, and it is what it is. So that's it for now. Hope to see you next week. Go to fullcrazytown.com to order my book or to see past or present podcasts. And I hope to see you again next week, Sunday, 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for episode 5. Take it easy, have fun, and be safe.